Hi friends, Tamsin here from Babbling Books, and today I'm going to be creating the ultimate guide to choosing the right notebook to create your travel journal. I've had a lot of questions from people about what is the right notebook to use for travel journaling, what is the best notebook to use for travel journaling, and I guess the answer is going to be it really depends on what kind of trip you're going on, what kinds of journaling you like to do, whether you want a bullet journal or a more of a creative scrapbooky style of journal. There's so many different options, but what I want to do today is take you through a bunch of different types of notebooks. I'm going to test them all out individually with the same kind of pens, the same kind of markers, the same kinds of glue, and show you what they look like with all of these different mediums applied to them, so you can really make an informed decision about what is going to work the best for your travel journal, or indeed for any other kind of journaling. For this video, I have teamed up with the Australian stationery company and store Milligram. You can find out more information about them in the description box below. They have provided me with 4 very excellent journals that I'm going to test out, and I also have 2 types of journals which are ones that I already owned and had purchased myself. So I'm going to be showing you each of those notebooks individually, and I'll leave timestamps in the description box below, so if there's a particular kind of journal that you just want to see, you can jump straight to having a look at that. I'm going to get started now, and I can't wait to see how the different sizes of paper and the different textures and colors look when I test them out with all these different techniques. This is the Nuuna Notebook Voyager M. It's 135 by 200 millimeters, and it has 176 numbered pages, which makes it the largest notebook that I'm going to be testing as part of this video in terms of the number of pages. It has a dot grid design, which is typical of bullet journal style journals, and it has some other interesting features which I think are quite useful for travelers. The first one, which is obviously the strap. It's an elastic strap with a plastic section, and it's designed to hold a pen and your phone or some other small device. Could even be used to hold another smaller notepad. And it holds it on there quite strongly, and you can see that it's not moving at all. I think this is a really useful feature if this is the style of journal that you like to keep, and the added bonus of having the strap is that it will help keep your pages all nice and neatly flat. Another interesting feature of this journal is that it has these lovely shiny silver metallic page edges. This is a really nice touch, and the notebook itself feels lovely and smooth. So first up, I'm going to test out some different kinds of pens and highlighters and watercolors. Then I'll flip the page over and give you an idea of whether or not they're bleeding through, whether there's any ghosting, so those shadows that you can see of something that has been written or drawn on the page. And I'll also check when I'm using the fountain pen whether or not there's any feathering, which is when the ink bleeds along the fibers of the page. So what we can see here is that there is a slight bleed through from the highlighter. Just at the tops of some of these points there's a little bit of show through. There's also a little bit of bleeding through from the Copic Multiliner when it's pressed quite hard, and from the fountain pen, both when I'm doing long strokes and when writing. There's actually not that much buckling of the paper in the section where I've used watercolor. As long as you don't use too much water, I think this paper would be fine. The main pen that didn't bleed through at all was the Uni-Ball Micro, and you can see that there is ghosting from all the different kinds of pens here. Now I'm going to put together a test page as though this is a travel journal, and I will use this to test out a couple more techniques that you might use. So this is my test spread. So when I look over on the other side, the glue that I used, which is just a generic glue stick, hasn't really buckled the pages or caused too much warping. There's a little bit of warping there from the moisture of the glue, but nothing too significant. The double-sided tape works perfectly. You can see that there is a bit of ghosting from the ballpoint pen and very, very slight ghosting and a tiny bit of bleed through once again from the highlighters. There's ghosting from the ink pad and stamp, but there isn't bleed through from the stamp, which is better than what I expected. So overall, I'm really happy with this page. One thing that I have noticed and that I do want to point out is the page numbers are really great, but the margins are quite wide between the edge of the page and where the dot grid starts. So it's starting to look a little bit strange in terms of my layout, just very different to the moleskin journal that I'm used to. So this is the Kunisawa Find notebook. It's A5 size and it has grid lines throughout and only 80 pages. For comparison, this is the Nuuna notebook, and you can see that the Kunisawa Find is slightly larger and is a lot thinner owing to the different amount of pages that they have. This notebook also has shiny edges, though they are a Copic design. Inside it has a quote that says, "I do not seek, I find." So let's have a look and see how this is appearing. So we've got a little bit of ghosting on the highlighter, but no bleed through, which is great. The Copic Multiliner, there's a fair bit of ghosting because it's quite a dark pen, and the Uni-Ball Micro is also got some ghosting, but no bleed through on either of those two. The fountain pen is still bleeding through a little bit here, and you can see it's ghosting quite a lot. The watercolor has less ghosting, but is really quite significantly sort of warped and bubbling the pages. So I definitely wouldn't recommend this paper for watercolor. And you can see on the other side that when it comes to feathering, there is actually a fair bit of feathering on the fountain pen. This is the Kunisawa Find with a sample page layout, and let's check how these different elements have gone when we turn over the page. So there's a little bit of ghosting from the rubber stamp with the charcoal color ink. There's actually quite a lot of ghosting and a little bit of bleed through from the ballpoint pen, which is really quite surprising and not a particularly good sign. The glue has slightly warped the pages, more of a warp than the Nuuna notebook, but nothing too significant. I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Once again, the double-sided tape has made no mark, and there's the slight ghosting from the highlighters. Something that I've noticed and really like about this notebook is that the grid lines go all the way to the edge and they are nicely spaced apart. So my writing felt more comfortable between these gaps. Comparing it to a plain white piece of paper, you can see that there's a soft yellow color to the pages, which is a personal preference of whether or not you like that on your pages, but I actually really do like it. So this is the Milligram brand set of 2 everyday notebooks. These are A5 size, so 148 by 210 millimeters. And this particular set has blank pages, but I believe that they also come with lined or ruled pages as well as an option. These ones contain 80 pages, and you can see that the set of 2 has 2 different colors. When you compare it to the Nuuna notebook, you can see that they're slightly larger, a little bit longer and a little bit wider, but obviously owing to the much smaller number of pages, they're a lot thinner. And as I mentioned, inside they're blank with a little bit of information about Milligram brand at the back, and they have the word blank written on the front with a sort of a foil design. So here we have the pen test and the sample page. So let's have a look first at the pen test. There's a fair bit of ghosting. It's actually quite strong. You can see coming through on all of these different types. So the highlighter is showing through pretty clearly. Same with the Copic Multiliner, the Uni-Ball Micro, the fountain pen, and there's even quite a lot of ghosting from the watercolor paint. There's very little bleed through. In fact, there's only a tiny like a single little dot here from the fountain pen and a dot or two from the Copic Multiliner. So actually in terms of bleed through, there's very little, which is really good sign. Going back to look at the fountain pen, I would say that in terms of feathering, this paper is fountain pen friendly. There's almost no feathering out of the ink when I've been writing here and testing out the fountain pen. The watercolor, unfortunately, is not suitable on this paper at all. It's buckled quite a lot and the watercolor has come through the page completely. So I definitely wouldn't recommend this for watercolor. However, if you were not planning to write on both sides of the paper, I think this would actually be fine with pretty much any of these pens. You just have to be aware that there will be some ghosting. When we look over here at the sample page, so when you turn it over, you can see once again that there is quite a lot of ghosting here, showing through pretty clearly. Surprisingly, you can also see here that the text, which was on the back of these images that I pasted on, is actually showing through, and you can read that text, which could be a little bit of a concern, especially if you were planning to do journal pages on both sides. However, there isn't any bleed through, it's just that kind of shadowy ghosting effect of the page here. And when I compare the page to a plain white piece of printer paper, you can see that it's pretty much the same color. It's quite a pale, maybe slightly off-white color we can see, but it's a very pale white paper. Here we have the School of Life set of 3 Feminist notebooks. These are B6 size, which is 12 by 18 centimeters, and they're a set of 3 with 3 different colors, so dark purple, lilac, and yellow. One is blank, one is grid, and one is lined. So when I compare this to the Nuuna notebook, you can see that the Nuuna is a bit larger. Of course, once again, owing to the much smaller number of pages, they're a lot thinner. Because these notebooks are part of the Feminist notebook set, each one has some biographical information inside about a different feminist thinker. We have Simone de Beauvoir in the yellow, which is the lined notebook. We have Germaine Greer in the lilac, which is the grid notebook, and John Stuart Mill in the violet notebook, which is the blank paged. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be testing out the pale purple notebook, which is grid, because that's my favorite design. So here we have the pages testing out the different types of pens and watercolor, followed by the sample page. We'll have a look first at the pen tests, and you can probably see quite clearly here that there is very little ghosting, which really surprises me. I was a little bit worried about this paper, but it's actually turned out really well in terms of ghosting. There's no bleed through at all, and there's just a little bit of ghosting when you look at the green highlighter up the top here, but it's pretty faint. Also, surprisingly, it has worked really well with the watercolor. There's a little bit, I think you can probably see here, there's a slight warping or buckling of the pages where the watercolor was applied, but I think as long as you didn't use too much water, actually the watercolor could work on this paper. If we check back on the fountain pen, I wouldn't say that this paper is fountain pen friendly. There is a fair bit of feathering around the edges of the words. Let's have a look how the sample page has turned out on the back. So once again, the same as with the pen test, there's very little ghosting at all showing through here, maybe a slight bit of ghosting where the ballpoint pen was used quite heavily to create the heading, but overall very little show through from anything, and definitely no bleed coming through. So it would be very easy to use this paper for double-sided journaling. One thing to note here, which may not be really clear on the video, is that the grid lines are really dark. They're noticeably darker than other notebooks that I've tested in this video, and that might be distracting for some people. I found it a little bit challenging to write on. They're also a larger spaced grid than the Nuuna notebook, and the grid design goes all the way to the edge of the page with no margin. When I compare this notebook to a plain white piece of printer paper, you can see that the color is fairly similar. It is quite a pale white paper, but it has a slight gray tint to it rather than a creamy sort of tone. Next up, we have the Travelers Company Travelers Notebook Free Diary. So this is item number 19 from the Travelers Notebook collection. And it is the free diary, which means that it has a weekly diary on one side and a grid style memo on the other. This is the large size of the Traveler's Notebook, which is 11 by 21 centimeters and will fit inside the large size Traveler's Notebook leather covers. It has 64 pages, which covers 28 weeks or 6 months of the year. In terms of size, if we compare it to the Nuuna notebook, you'll see that it is slightly taller overall, but a lot narrower and much slimmer given the significantly lower number of pages. So inside, this is what it looks like. Down the left-hand page, there is space for you to fill in the date, and the days of the week, and on the right hand side, as I mentioned before, there is a grid design with slightly heavier weight lines to indicate the days of the week down here. Now you might recognize this style of diary because I used this as my journal for the entire year last year, and I'll link to that video in the description box down below if you'd like to see how I used that. That was the dated version. Now this is the undated version, and I thought this was a great idea for a travel journal because you could fit multiple trips into this same notebook. So over the course of a year or a couple of years, every time you go on a trip, you could fill in the relevant dates down the left-hand side, and you could start to build this up as a log of the various different trips that you've been on. So once again, testing out the various different pens and watercolor paint on this page. Let's see how they look. So overall, it's fairly good. There is some ghosting from all of the different kinds, but nothing really significant. I don't feel like it's interfering if you were to write on both sides of the paper. I think that it would still be legible and it's not going to distract too much. The Copic Multiliner is probably showing through the most. The highlighter is showing through a little bit, but not too much. The Uni-Ball Micro is barely ghosting at all, and the fountain pen is about the same. So overall, there is no bleed through. I can't see any bleed through even from the watercolor paint, which is a really good sign, and there is that vague ghosting. The watercolor paint has slightly buckled the page. If I hold it up here, you'll see that it's only very, very slight. I think the watercolor is actually working quite well on this paper, which is pretty surprising because it does feel like thin paper. Probably wouldn't recommend using watercolor with a lot of water, but if you used a small amount of water, I think you could get away with it on this paper. In terms of the fountain pen, this paper is definitely fountain pen friendly. There is no feathering at all, and it wrote really, really smoothly and felt really nice to write on this paper. Now for the test page. So of course this is slightly different in terms of the layout to the other pages that I have tested, but it gives you an idea of how you could lay out the various different days of your trip and then use the memo side for highlights and various different bits and pieces. When we look at this in terms of ghosting and bleed through for the ballpoint pen, you can see that there is some ghosting down this side, but it's not that noticeable. There's a tiny little bit of bleed through where I've gone over quite heavily on the heading, but overall I think this is pretty good for travel journaling. And on the other page, we can check the stamp pad and the highlighter as well as the glue. So you can see that there's a little bit of ghosting from the stamp pad, but nothing too significant there. You can't notice the highlighter really at all. And once again, you can actually read a little bit of the information which was on the back of those images which I cut out from brochures. So that's just something to be aware of if you're planning to stick a lot of things into this journal, is that they do show through a little bit. When I compare this to a plain white piece of paper, you can see that it's slightly yellow. This is just a very soft yellow tint to the pages. And the other thing that is worth noting is that the grid lines are smaller than some of the others that I have tested so far, and they're much paler, so they're not as distracting when you're writing with a black pen as some of the other grid lines have been. Finally, we have the Rollbahn notebook from Delfonics. This is the medium size, which is 11 by 14 centimeters, and it has the traditional Delfonics grid design. It has 120 pages and 5 plastic pockets, plus this little elastic strap which keeps it closed. This is the only spiral bound notebook that I've tested out, and I thought it would be interesting to give it a try and contrast it with the others. This is it compared to the Nuuna notebook. You can see in terms of size it's quite close for the number of pages, and that's because of the ring binding, not because of the similar number of pages. But it is significantly smaller, so it's interesting to test it out. It's more of a pocket size style journal. For a traveler's notebook, this has quite a few interesting little features which I think are quite useful to explore. So obviously the elastic strap to keep it closed is really helpful. The fact that it is spiral bound means that it lays completely flat and open, which can be really useful, particularly if you are drawing. It also has some clear plastic pockets at the back. So just to give you a demonstration, I've stuck a piece of washi tape on here. I think this could be used as a little sample page if you wanted to take washi tape with you. And the plastic pockets are useful for storing receipts or cards or little bits and pieces that you're planning to stick into your travel journal. So there's 5 of those little plastic pockets there at the back. The other feature of this notebook is that all of the pages are perforated. Now you don't need to worry about them coming out while you're traveling or using this notebook. They are attached very strongly and they're not a loose sort of style of perforation. But it is an interesting feature to consider if you think that you might be writing the kinds of notes where you'd like to tear them out. And it tears out very cleanly. You can see it's a nice sharp edge here. So let's test it out and see how it looks. So once again, we have our page of pen tests and watercolor and a sample page of journaling. Looking first at the page of pen tests, you can see that there is some ghosting from each of the different types of pens, though it's probably the most noticeable when you look at the Copic Multiliner, and also the highlighter is showing through fairly strongly. One thing that I did notice was that there isn't any bleed through from any of these types of pens, which is really good to see, especially because the paper does feel fairly thin. It's obviously suitable for various different kinds of inks, which is great. When you look at the watercolor, I would say this paper isn't really suitable for watercolor painting unless you used very, very little water. You can see if I hold it up like this that it has sort of bubbled quite significantly. And if we look back over on the front, this paper is definitely fountain pen friendly as well. I haven't got any feathering and it was lovely and smooth to write on. Looking over at the sample page, we see on the other side here, there is a little bit of ghosting, particularly from the stamp starting to show through. Ballpoint pen is showing through a little bit, but not so significantly that you would feel that you couldn't write on both sides of the paper. There's a tiny, tiny little shadow of bleed through just beginning where I've gone over quite heavily on the heading, so that's something to be conscious of when deciding the style of heading that you'd like to do. The thing to note here is that the grid lines are very, very faint. They're really not interfering with the design at all, and they're not noticeable. They're actually, if you look really closely, made up of dots rather than straight lines. Other things that are noteworthy is that the lines go all the way to the edge of the page, so there isn't any margin here. And when I compare it to a white piece of paper, you can start to see that it really is a distinctive yellow shade. Because the page is so much smaller, you really can notice that a lot less information fits on these pages. And I think that this is the kind of journal which is most suitable for sketching or note-taking rather than the more collage style journal, simply because the size means that it's difficult to fit very much in the way of collage on a page like this. So that's it. those are all of the 6 journals that I have that I wanted to test out for you and explore how they could work for travel journals. I hope that's been helpful for you. I hope you've discovered something that is going to be just perfect for your next trip. If you'd like to watch some of my videos flicking through my journals and showing you the different techniques and approaches that I used, I will leave links to all of them in the description box below. And there's also a playlist that you can play through as well, which I will leave after this video has ended. I love making these videos about journaling, and if you love watching them and sharing them with your friends, I would love to make more of them. So let me know in the comments below what kinds of videos you like to see from me, and if you have any burning questions about journaling that I might be able to answer.